Hello and welcome to the final revision video on living under Nazi rule, all about the fifth chapter, what did Nazi rule mean for the people of Europe between 1939 and 1945. So we compared the occupation of Poland and the Netherlands. So Poland first of all. The Nazis viewed Eastern Europe as land there to be taken, to be conquered, for Lebensraum, living space for Germans to move into. They planned to destroy any traces of Polish culture and to Germanise the country, so even going as far as replacing the name of the country Poland and instead breaking it into different regions. The main part of Poland where Poles were forced now to live was given the name of the General Government, and from 1940 hundreds of thousands of Poles were forcibly moved into this area and out of other areas of Poland. They're replaced with ethnic Germans, so people moving from Germany itself. Hans Frank is the man who becomes Governor General of Poland. He plays a big role in attempting to destroy Polish culture. Remember, under Nazi kind of racial ideology, Poles and Slavs from Eastern Europe were subhuman, were beneath them. So laws are passed to control Polish people. Things like they are forced to wear a P on their arm if they are working for the Germans or working in Germany itself. Sexual relationships between Germans and Poles are forbidden, and eventually Jewish Poles are rounded up and forced into ghettos. In terms of destroying Polish culture, this takes the form of basically targeting schools and universities, replacing Polish literature, Polish theatre, Polish language wherever possible there as well. Schools are completely transformed, and any sort of traces of Polish identity are removed. Poles were also deported to other parts of the country, but also into Germany itself to be used as labourers. Poland's Jewish population is almost entirely wiped out during this period of Nazi rule. There's about 3.5 million Poles, Jewish Poles. 3 million of those people are murdered during this occupation. Despite this, there's quite a strong and ongoing Polish resistance to Nazi rule. People who launch sort of random attacks on German soldiers and German politicians, assassinations and murders, those types of things, as well as a government in exile, as well as people who help Jewish people escape as well. In contrast to Poland then, we looked at the Netherlands. So the Netherlands was invaded in May 1940, but the crucial difference here is that the Dutch were seen by the Nazis as Aryans and as part of the master race of people. So therefore, just from the outset, the way that the Dutch were treated in comparison to the Poles was much, much softer. For example, things like the Dutch government, there's very little change in that. Some people resign and some people are sacked from it, but the vast majority of people who worked for the Dutch government before the invasion continue to work for them. The education system is left unchanged. There are attempts, though, from the Dutch to resist. Things like wearing a carnation, a symbol of the Dutch royal family, who were forced into exile after the Nazis invaded. People went through the streets wearing these carnations. However, there was no real punishment for them doing this, as this kind of open sign of resistance. Jews began to be deported from the Netherlands in 1941, and this leads to large-scale strikes across the country, and this is a change now in the way that people are going to be treated. This resistance is seen as a step too far by the Nazis. Crowds of striking workers are fired upon, and when the strike is broken up, leaders and ringleaders of the strike are given death sentences. What follows is further persecution of Jewish people, including deportations to death camps in Eastern Europe. Dutch citizens are also used as the war goes on, particularly in the final couple of years of the war, as the war's going badly for Germany, are being used as forced labourers. By 1943, all Dutch men between the ages of 18 and 35 were forced to become labourers. However, there's again quite strong resistance to this. Of the 170,000 men that were supposed to attend and supposed to become workers for the Nazis, only 54,000 did so. So widespread resistance is present throughout these final years of Nazi rule. Around 300,000 men are in hiding to avoid being called up as forced labourers, but there's also lots more people involved in the illegal printing of leaflets and posters to criticise the Nazis. Armed resistance also begins in 1944 with people violently rising up. The final months of Nazi occupation of the Netherlands is marked by severe food shortages, and around 20,000 Dutch people starve in the final year of the war. After 5 years of occupation, the Netherlands is liberated by Canadian forces in May 1945. So the story of Jewish persecution then in Eastern Europe is one which we can kind of break into two halves. The first couple of years of Nazi rule, which involves mainly persecution and deportation and ghettoization, but also some murder too, and quite large amounts of murder, before the second phase, when we'll talk about the sort of extreme mass murder that takes place of the Holocaust. So the Nazis at first, in countries that they take over, begin to persecute Jews in the same way that they have been doing in Germany itself since taking power in 1933. For example, after they occupy Austria in 1938, the Jewish population are attacked and demonized through propaganda, but also physically and violently, and basically publicly shamed and publicly humiliated. So there's examples of things of Jewish Austrian Jews being forced into the streets and made to scrub and clean the streets while crowds of onlookers sort of watched and laughed at them. This sort of harsh treatment of Jewish people was sort of designed to make many Jewish people consider emigrating and leaving Austria. And indeed, in the first 2 years of Nazi rule in Austria, over 100,000 Jews do emigrate and leave the country. From 1939 onwards, the Nazis, after their invasion of Poland and into Eastern Europe, they start ghettoizing Jewish people. These are walled off areas of cities where people are forced to live. The image on the screen at the moment shows the Warsaw Ghetto, one of the biggest ghettos used by the Nazis. And as you can see, it's massively overcrowded, poor sanitation, very little access to food and healthcare, and the types of things that people would need to survive. Most of these ghettos are liquidated, is the word that the Nazis use, then in the second half of the Second World War, after 1942, as people are taken to extermination camps. So the Nazis make the decision in 1942 at a conference in a place called Wannsee that there will now be a final solution to the Jewish question, is what they say. So it's a decision that all Jewish people now that come under Nazi rule are to be rounded up and murdered. There's already been killing going on though, as soon as World War II begins, and even in these years now into 1942 and 43, a group of the SS called the Einsatzgruppen, whose role it is to murder Jewish people in places that they take over. This is done though on a much more kind of ad hoc basis rather than the systematic murder that takes place in death camps. This period of the Holocaust has become known as the Holocaust by bullets, and around 1.5 million people are killed in this way, literally rounded up, taken to an open space, sometimes they're shot into a river, sometimes they're shot into a ravine, sometimes a big pit is dug and people are shot and killed into them. And from 1942 onwards we get extermination camps, so places like Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, but most famously of all probably Auschwitz-Birkenau. So Auschwitz-Birkenau is located in Poland, relatively close to the city of Krakow, and over 1.1 million people were murdered there. Around 1 in 6 victims of the Holocaust are killed at Auschwitz. At its height of killing, Auschwitz was murdering around 12,000 people per day. People arrive on cattle trucks, sometimes after days or weeks of journeys in these cattle trucks. You can see people die on the journey due to a lack of food, a lack of sanitation, a lack of medicine. Upon arrival, people are sorted into 2 groups. Around 90% of people are chosen to be murdered straight away. Older people, children, anyone with any kind of physical weakness. The others are used as slave labourers for a short period of time, on average a couple of months, before then they would also either die from the poor conditions or were themselves murdered. They're forced into gas chambers and poisoned with Zyklon B gas. The Sonderkommando were a group of prisoners whose role it was to then empty gas chambers and cremate the bodies after people had been poisoned. Again, these people were replaced every few months with new people, and they themselves were murdered. The camp was destroyed towards the end of 1944 as it became clear that the Russian army was quickly approaching. The Nazis attempted to cover up their crimes, blowing up the gas chambers. Prisoners that remained were evacuated and taken on what were called death marches back into German-controlled territory, and again, thousands of people die on these as well. So the final thing to think about is how people responded to Nazi rule. And ultimately, there was 3 kind of responses. The first response was to collaborate, to actively work with the Nazis, to support them in what they were doing, and promote their aims. The second response was accommodation. So this was when people essentially did as they were told, but without any real enthusiasm, but did it largely to protect themselves and save their own skin. And finally, people who resisted the Nazis, who actively defied what they were told to do, and even some people went as far as fighting back and taking up arms against the Nazis. The picture on the screen shows Polish resistance fighters who launched armed attacks on the Nazis. So a case study was France. We looked at 2 different people. So the man who's pictured, André Trocmé, he was a resistor, he was a Protestant pastor. He arranged for Jews to be hidden in the region of France that he lived in, and with others forged ID cards and ration cards, and in some cases even led people out of France over the border into neutral Switzerland. Trocmé was arrested in 1943, but was originally released. However, he then went into hiding himself, realising that it was no longer safe for him to be publicly around. In total, he probably is responsible for the rescue or the protection of over 5,000 Jewish people in France. The other case study was Coco Chanel, a famous fashion designer and perfume maker. She had a romantic relationship with a German officer. And when the Nazis passed anti-Semitic legislation in France, anti-Semitic laws, that allowed company directors to replace Jewish directors and take over their ownership or their parts of the company, Coco Chanel took advantage of this and became sole owner of the company. She basically took the share of the company from Jewish directors. Some people say, or historians more recently have decided or have looked at the possibility that she was actually a sympathiser of the Nazis and a Nazi agent, suggesting that she was spying for the Nazis as well. Although there is some people that disagree with this, there is evidence that definitely suggests that she was a collaborator with the Nazis. And finally, elsewhere in Europe, there was all kinds of different responses to collaboration, resistance and accommodation. In Denmark, again, much like the Dutch, the Danes were treated better than people in Eastern Europe, again, because they were seen as Aryans. They were able to keep up trading with Germany and keep relatively decent relations with the Nazis. This allowed them to sort of stand up to German demands for anti-Jewish legislation and anti-Jewish laws and prevent Danish Jews from being deported. French resistance fighters, that's who's pictured again here. They fight throughout the Second World War, doing all kinds of different things, hiding Jews, rescuing Jews, but also launching armed attacks on the Nazis. In some parts of Europe, though, there is other people who see Nazi rule as an opportunity to advance their own causes. So nationalists in Serbia and Croatia actually support Nazi rule and themselves work with the Nazis and round up and execute and murder opponents of the Nazis kind of off their own back. And finally, you have Polish resistance as well. So a group of 4 brothers called the Bielski Partisans. They managed to escape from the ghetto and lived and hid in a forest. Hundreds of men, women and children joined them, and at one stage there's well over 1,000 people who are members of this partisan group. They completed numerous attacks and sabotage missions on the Nazis.